The laughter of her stepmother was a sharp, brittle thing, like ice cracking under a heavy boot. It followed the carriage as it rattled away from the curb, a final, parting gift of pure malice. Annalise sat ramrod straight on the worn velvet seat, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone-white against the drab grey of her gown. The gown itself was a masterpiece of humiliation, a faded relic from a forgotten servant, chosen specifically for its ill fit and washed-out colour that made her skin look sallow and her hair appear dull as straw. She was a joke. That was the point of this entire, excruciating exercise. Her stepmother, Baroness Evangeline, had announced the summons over breakfast with a triumphant smirk. The Duke of Blackwood, the formidable and reclusive Iron Duke, had requested her presence. Her stepsisters had tittered into their napkins, their eyes dancing with cruel delight. Annalise knew, with the certainty of long suffering, that no such request had been made. This was a story concocted by the Baroness, a performance designed to have Annalise thrown from the Duke's doorstep like a beggar, cementing her status as a worthless burden. The carriage swayed, and she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. A pale, pinched face stared back, framed by hair scraped back so severely it pulled at her temples. There were no softening tendrils, no artful curls. Evangeline had seen to that. Annalise looked like a scullery maid, and a particularly plain one at that. A wave of heat washed over her skin, a familiar tide of shame. For years she had been made to feel invisible, a ghost haunting the halls of her own home. Now she was being sent out to have that invisibility confirmed by one of the most powerful men in England. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She wished she could just disappear. She wished she had the strength to leap from the moving carriage and run until the city was a smudge on the horizon. But she had nowhere to run to. Since her father's death a decade ago, her world had shrunk to the size of her stepmother's contempt. Resilience was her only currency, a quiet, stubborn refusal to break, even as she was bent low. She would endure this, as she had endured everything else. She would walk to that door, suffer the butler's scorn, and carry the memory of her dismissal back home, another scar to add to her collection. The carriage slowed, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the pristine cobblestones of a grand square. Annalise peered out the window. Blackwood Manor was not a house, it was a fortress. A monolith of grey stone and dark, unblinking windows, it seemed to absorb the afternoon light, giving none of it back. It looked as cold and unyielding as its master's reputation. The stories about Duke Alastair Beaumont were legion, a man of ruthless business acumen with a heart of ice and a past shrouded in tragedy. He was said to have never smiled, not once, in a public setting. The carriage door was opened by a footman whose expression was a perfect mask of polite indifference. He did not offer a hand. Annalise gathered the thin fabric of her skirt and stepped down, her worn slippers making no sound on the pavement. She stood for a moment, a small grey figure before the colossal black door, feeling the weight of 1,000 judging eyes from the windows of the neighbouring townhouses. She took a breath, the air tasting of dust and defeat, and began the long walk up the stone steps. Each step was a lifetime. She imagined the door opening and a sneering butler looking her up and down, his lip curling in disgust. She imagined him slamming the door in her face. She imagined returning to the Baroness's triumphant questions, her stepsister's gleeful mockery. The humiliation was so vivid, so complete in her mind, that the reality almost felt like an afterthought. She reached the top step, her hand rising, trembling, to reach for the heavy iron knocker. Before her knuckles could make contact, the door swung silently inward. Annalise's hand froze in mid-air, her breath caught in her throat. It was not a butler who stood in the shadowed entryway. It was him, the Duke of Blackwood. He was taller than she had imagined, broader of shoulder, his presence filling the space entirely. His face was all harsh lines and sharp angles, as if carved from granite, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm. They were fixed on her, not with scorn or surprise, but with an unnerving, unreadable intensity. A chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon air snaked down her spine. He said nothing. His gaze swept over her, but it did not linger on the threadbare dress or the scraped-back hair. It was a look that seemed to bypass the miserable surface and peer directly into the terrified heart of her. Annalise could not move, could not speak. She was trapped in the force of his stillness. He stepped back, holding the door wider. His voice, when it finally came, was a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in the very stone beneath her feet. "Miss Annalise," he said, and the simple use of her name from this stranger was a shock. "Please, come in." She entered as if in a dream, her limbs feeling disconnected from her mind. The hall was vast and silent, panelled in dark wood that gleamed with age and polish. Suits of armor stood like silent sentinels, their metal faces inscrutable. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and old paper. He closed the door behind her, the heavy click echoing in the immense quiet, sealing them inside together. He did not summon a servant. He led her himself, his long strides measured and sure, down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Annalise followed a pace behind, her eyes fixed on the formidable line of his back, clad in a perfectly tailored black coat. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. This was not the script. Where was the dismissal, the derision? This quiet, formal courtesy was more disorienting than any insult could have been. He led her into a library that took her breath away. Books soared from floor to ceiling on 2 levels, their leather spines a rich tapestry of crimson, green, and gold. A fire crackled in a cavernous fireplace, casting a warm, flickering light over the room. In the center of the room, 2 large armchairs faced the hearth. He gestured toward one of them. "Please," he said, "sit." Annalise obeyed, sinking into the soft leather. The chair seemed to swallow her small frame. She watched as he moved to stand before the fire, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece. The flames danced in his dark eyes, making them seem alive with some deep, hidden emotion. He looked at her for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was a taut wire between them. "I have been expecting you," he said at last. The words fell like stones into the frozen pond of her confusion. You have, Your Grace," she stammered, her voice a thin whisper. How could he have been? The entire venture was her stepmother's cruel whim. "I was made aware of your stepmother's intentions," he stated, his tone flat, devoid of judgment. "She is not as subtle as she believes herself to be." A fresh wave of shame washed over Annalise. He knew. He knew she had been sent here as a fool, a pawn in a malicious game. She lowered her gaze to her hands, twisting in her lap. "Then I must apologize for the intrusion, Your Grace. I will take my leave." She made to stand, but his voice stopped her. "Do not." It was not a request. It was a soft command, yet it held the weight of iron. "This intrusion, as you call it, has provided an opportunity. One I have been waiting for." She looked up, her brow furrowed in bewilderment. He pushed away from the mantelpiece and walked toward the other chair, but he did not sit. He stood before her, a towering, shadowed figure against the firelight. His expression was as serious as she had ever seen on a human being. "Miss Annalise," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "I have a proposition for you. It is unconventional, and you are under no obligation to consider it. But I ask that you hear me out." She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. I wish for you to be my wife. The world tilted on its axis. The crackling of the fire, the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, the very beat of her own heart, it all faded into a deafening roar in her ears. She stared at him, certain she had misheard, or perhaps this was the true punchline of the joke. A piece of theatre so cruel and elaborate that her stepmother must have paid him a fortune to perform it. The thought was absurd, but no more absurd than the words he had just spoken.
Your Grace?
She finally managed, her voice trembling. I do not understand. This must be some mistake, a jest. I do not jest, he said, and the profound gravity in his eyes told her it was the truth. I am in need of a duchess. You are in need of an escape. I am proposing a marriage of convenience, a partnership. He began to pace slowly before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. My title demands I marry and produce an heir. It is a duty I have long neglected. The matchmakers and ambitious mothers of the ton have become tiresome. I require a wife who is intelligent, poised, and understands the value of privacy. Someone who will not be interested in the frivolities of society. He paused and turned to face her again. You, Miss Annalise, would have your freedom. You would be the Duchess of Blackwood. This house and all my properties would be your domain. You would have a bottomless allowance and the protection of my name. You would never have to see your stepmother or her daughters again unless you wished it. Your life would be your own, entirely. Her mind struggled to process the scale of what he was offering. It was not a life, it was a kingdom. An escape so complete, so absolute, it felt like a fantasy. But why her? A penniless spinster in a servant's dress? It made no sense. But why me? She whispered. You could have any woman in England. Women of beauty, of fortune, of impeccable connections. A flicker of something, was it pain, crossed his features. So fleeting, she thought she might have imagined it. The women you speak of want a duke. They want the title, the power, the fantasy. I am not interested in a wife who is in love with a caricature. I require a partner, a quiet life. I believe you and I desire the same thing. He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. I also knew your father. The mention of her father was a physical shock. No one had spoken of him with such simple respect in a decade. You knew the Earl? He was a good man, the Duke said, his voice softer now. An honourable man. He would not be pleased with your current circumstances. This was the first crack in the Iron Duke's armour. A hint of a person beneath the title. A man who remembered her father. Annalise looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time she saw not just a powerful aristocrat, but a man offering her a lifeline. It was a cold, strange lifeline, wrapped in a business proposal, but it was a way out of the drowning depths of her life. Hope, a terrifying and unfamiliar sensation, began to bloom in her chest. It was a fragile thing, easily crushed, but for the first time in 10 years, it was there. She thought of her stepmother's mocking laughter. She thought of a future spent as an unpaid servant, withering into bitter old age. And then she looked at the Duke, at his serious, waiting face. If I agree, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, what are your terms? Simple, he replied. We would be partners in all public matters. In private, we would lead separate lives. I am a man of routine and solitude. I would not impose upon your time, and I would expect the same courtesy. You would have your own wing of the house. Your days would be your own to fill as you see fit. Respect, discretion, and the eventual provision of an heir, those are my only terms. separate lives. The words should have sounded cold, but to Annalise they sounded like freedom. She would not be expected to perform the part of a loving wife, a role she could not imagine playing. She would be a chatelaine, a partner. She would be safe. She took a deep breath, the scent of old books and wood smoke filling her lungs. It smelled like sanctuary. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady for the first time since she had entered the house. "I accept, Your Grace." A barely perceptible easing of the tension in his shoulders was his only reaction. "Very well," he said. "I will have my solicitor draw up the settlement papers. We will be married by special license at the end of the week." The speed of it was dizzying, but she understood. He was a man of action, of efficiency. He was cutting the Gordian knot of her life with a single, decisive stroke. He walked over to a velvet pull cord and gave it a firm tug. Moments later, a severe-looking housekeeper in a black dress appeared at the door. "Mistress Finch," the Duke said. "This is Miss Annalise, my future wife. She will be staying with us. Please show her to the Duchess's suite, and see to it that she has everything she requires. A new wardrobe, to begin with." The housekeeper's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her professional mask fell back into place. She curtsied deeply. "Of course, Your Grace." Annalise stood, her legs unsteady. It was happening. It was real. She was not returning to her stepmother's house. She turned to the Duke. "Thank you," she murmured, the words feeling wholly inadequate. He simply inclined his head. "I will see you at dinner, Miss Annalise. 7 o'clock. As she followed Mistress Finch from the library, she glanced back one last time. He was standing exactly where she had left him, a solitary figure silhouetted against the fire. He looked, she thought, profoundly lonely. The days that followed were a blur of surreal activity. The Duchess's suite was a world unto itself, a series of rooms decorated in soft blues and creams, with a balcony overlooking a vast, walled garden. Dressmakers, milliners, and cobblers arrived in a steady stream, filling her new wardrobes with gowns of silk and velvet, shoes of soft leather, and hats adorned with delicate feathers. It was overwhelming. Annalise felt like an actress being fitted for a role she had not yet learned. Her interactions with the Duke were brief and unfailingly formal. They dined together each evening in a cavernous dining hall, seated at opposite ends of a long, polished table. Their conversation was stilted, revolving around neutral topics: the weather, a book he had read, her progress in settling in. He was polite, attentive even, but there was a wall around him, high and impenetrable. He was a perfect stranger who was about to become her husband. Yet there were moments, small fissures in his formidable facade. One afternoon he found her in the library, running a hand reverently over the leather-bound books. He asked about her favorite authors. The next day, a first edition of a cherished poetry collection, impossibly rare, appeared on the table in her sitting room. There was no note. Another time, she was sketching the winter garden from her balcony, a small, secret habit she had nurtured for years. Later that day, she discovered a small, unused room at the top of the house had been transformed. An easel stood by the north-facing window, along with a full set of artists' charcoals, pencils, and fine paper. Again, no word was spoken of it. These quiet, observant kindnesses were more unsettling than his distance. They hinted at a man who saw more than he let on, a man who paid attention to the smallest details of her quiet existence. It was a strange and potent form of intimacy, this silent consideration. It made her heart beat a little faster whenever she heard his footsteps in the hall. The news of their impending marriage struck the ton like a thunderclap. Her stepmother, Annalise learned through a clipped report from the Duke, had been apoplectic, first with disbelief, then with incandescent rage. Her grand joke had turned her into a laughingstock. She had tried to call at Blackwood Manor, but had been politely and firmly turned away at the door. The knowledge brought Annalise a sliver of dark satisfaction. Their first public appearance as an engaged couple was at the annual Hartsworth Ball. Annalise wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that the Duke himself had silently approved with a single, brief nod. She felt horribly exposed as they entered the ballroom, 100 pairs of eyes turning to stare. Whispers followed them like the rustling of dry leaves. She could feel the mixture of shock, envy, and derision in the air. Her hand tightened on the Duke's arm. His muscles were rigid beneath the fine wool of his coat. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. "They are insignificant." But they did not feel insignificant. Later in the evening, as the Duke was engaged in a terse conversation with a government minister, Annalise found herself cornered by Lady Seraphina Vale, a celebrated beauty who had made no secret of her ambition to become the next Duchess of Blackwood. "Well, well," Lady Seraphina said, her voice dripping with venom, though her smile was dazzling. "The little brown mouse herself. I must confess we are all utterly baffled. Tell me, what sort of dark magic did you use to ensnare the Duke? He has shown no interest in a woman in 10 years, and then he chooses you." She let her gaze travel dismissively over Annalise's gown. "A lucky purchase, I suppose. It is amazing what money can do for one's appearance." The insult was so direct, so public, that the small circle of listeners gasped. Annalise froze, the blood draining from her face. She had no defense against such polished cruelty. Her throat closed up, and she could think of nothing to say. "It is amazing, is it not?" A cold voice cut through the air. "What some people will do for attention." Alistair was there. He had appeared as if from nowhere, his formidable presence instantly silencing the chatter. He stood beside Annalise, his hand moving to rest protectively on the small of her back. He did not look at her. His stormy eyes were fixed on Lady Seraphina, and his gaze was glacial. "My fiancée's appearance," he continued, his voice dangerously soft, "is of no concern to you, nor are my reasons for choosing her. But since you are so very curious, allow me to enlighten you. I chose her because she possesses qualities you could not possibly comprehend. Grace, intelligence, and a character unblemished by malice." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Now, if you will excuse us, the air in this corner has grown rather foul." Without another glance, he guided Annalise away, leaving a stunned and humiliated Lady Seraphina in his wake. He led her toward the French doors that opened onto a deserted terrace. The cool night air was a balm on her heated skin. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing its icy edge. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He had defended her, not as a business partner, but with a ferocity that felt deeply personal. She looked up at him, at his stern profile outlined against the moonlight. The wall around him seemed to have vanished, replaced by a shield he had thrown around her. "Thank you," she whispered. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "No one is permitted to insult you, Annalise. You are to be my wife. An insult to you is an insult to me." She knew he was framing it within the terms of their agreement, a matter of honor and title. But the way he had looked at Lady Seraphina, the quiet fury in his voice, it felt like more than that. A dangerous, foolish hope began to flutter again in her chest, stronger this time. She was beginning to see the man her father had called a friend, and she was beginning to fear she was falling in love with him. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in the Duke's private chapel with only a handful of witnesses. Annalise wore a simple gown of ivory cream, and as Alistair slipped the heavy gold band onto her finger, his hand was surprisingly warm and steady. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood, The title felt strange, a costume she had yet to grow into. Their life settled into the routine he had promised. They were two solitary ships, passing in the grand, quiet corridors of the manor. They met for meals, exchanged pleasantries, and then retreated to their separate wings. He spent his days in his study, managing his vast estates and investments. She spent hers reading in the library, sketching in her studio, or walking through the gardens, slowly bringing the neglected flower beds back to life. It was a peaceful existence, and she was grateful for it. She was safe. She was free. And yet, a deep, aching loneliness began to settle in her heart. She found herself listening for his footsteps, her day brightening at the brief, formal moments they shared. She yearned to know the man behind the impenetrable reserve, the man who left her thoughtful gifts and defended her honor, but the wall between them remained. One rainy evening, unable to sleep, she wandered down to the library in search of a book. She did not expect to find him there. He was seated in one of the armchairs before the dying fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was staring into the flames, but his gaze was distant, lost in memory. His face, unguarded in the dim light, was etched with a profound sorrow. She hesitated in the doorway, not wanting to intrude, but the raw vulnerability in his expression drew her forward. "Your Grace?" she said softly. He started, his head snapping up. The mask of cool indifference fell back into place instantly, but she had seen what lay beneath. "Annalise," he said, his voice slightly rough. "I did not hear you." "I could not sleep," she explained, moving closer to the fire. "May I join you?" He nodded, gesturing to the other chair. She sat, pulling a cashmere throw over her lap. The silence between them was different tonight, charged with the unspoken emotion she had witnessed on his face. She felt a surge of courage, a need to breach the chasm that separated them. "Alistair," she began, using his given name for the first time since their wedding. He looked at her, his eyes questioning. "This arrangement, it is more than I ever could have hoped for. You have given me a home, security. But I must know, I must understand why you truly chose me. The reason you gave, a marriage of convenience. It does not explain the books or the art studio. It does not explain what happened at the ball." He was silent for a long time, swirling the liquid in his glass. The fire popped and hissed, the only sound in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy, freighted with the weight of years. "You are right," he said, not looking at her. "It does not explain it." He took a deep drink from his glass before setting it aside. "I told you I knew your father. I did not tell you how." He turned his gaze to her, and the raw emotion was back in his eyes, stark and undisguised. "My parents died when I was 16. A carriage accident. It was sudden, violent. I was left with a title, a mountain of debt my father had hidden, and an estate in near ruin. I was utterly alone. Your father," he continued, his voice thick with memory, "was my guardian. He was my father's closest friend. In a world that saw only a new duke to be flattered or exploited, he saw a grieving boy. He took me under his wing. He taught me how to manage the estate, how to navigate the treacherous waters of business and politics. He saved my inheritance, and in doing so, he saved me. He was more of a father to me than my own had ever been." Annalise listened, her heart aching for the lonely boy he must have been. She finally understood the respect in his voice when he spoke of her father. "I spent a great deal of time at your family's country estate during those years," he said, his gaze becoming distant again. "And that is where I first saw you." A knot formed in her stomach. "You were 14, he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips for the first time. "You were always hiding in the garden with a book. You had this look of fierce concentration on your face. But sometimes you would look up and your eyes held so much light, so much life. You were everything that was bright and good in the world. He paused, his throat working. I loved you even then. A boy's silent, hopeless adoration from afar. You were the Earl's daughter, and I was his broken ward. I knew I had nothing to offer you, so I said nothing. I dedicated myself to rebuilding my family's fortune, telling myself that one day, when I was worthy, I would come for you. The confession hung in the air between them, so stunning, so world-altering, that Annalise could not breathe. But time, he said with a sigh, is a cruel master. Your father passed away. I heard what your stepmother was like. I watched from a distance as she tried to extinguish that light in you. And I did nothing. I was a coward. I was so trapped in the cold, ruthless persona I had built to survive, the Iron Duke, that I didn't know how to reach you. I thought my heart was as cold as my reputation, that I would only bring you more misery. So I waited, he whispered, his voice cracking with a decade of repressed emotion. I waited and watched and hated myself for my inaction. When I heard of your stepmother's plan to send you to my door, I saw it for what it was, a monstrously cruel act, but also my last chance. A desperate, foolish chance to do what I should have done 10 years ago. He finally looked at her fully, and his eyes were swimming with unshed tears. The Iron Duke was gone. In his place was a man, stripped bare, his heart laid open at her feet. The marriage of convenience was a lie, Annalise, a shield for my own fear. I offered you a partnership because I was terrified that if you saw the man, and not the Duke, you would find him wanting. Annalise felt a single tear trace a hot path down her cheek. Every quiet gesture, every moment of silent consideration, every protective act, it all clicked into place. It was not pity. It was not duty. It was love. A love that had waited, silently and patiently, for a decade. A love that had watched over her even when she felt most alone. Her own heart, which she had guarded so fiercely, broke open. The tentative affection she felt for him blossomed into a wave of overwhelming love, so powerful it left her breathless. He had not seen a plain, penniless spinster. He had seen her. She rose from her chair and crossed the space between them. She knelt on the rug before him, taking his large, trembling hands in her own. He looked at her, his expression one of agonizing uncertainty. She reached up and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the stern line of his jaw. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice thick with her own tears. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if it were a balm he had waited a lifetime to feel. "I see the man," she said, her voice clear and sure, "and I do not find him wanting." A choked sob escaped him. He opened his eyes, and the depth of love and relief she saw there stole her breath. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss into her palm, a gesture of such profound tenderness it felt more intimate than anything she had ever imagined. He gently framed her face with his hands, his thumbs stroking away her tears. "Annalise," he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was gentle, questioning, full of a decade of unspoken words and years of lonely longing. It was a promise, a beginning. In the quiet of the library, surrounded by old books and the dying embers of the fire, two solitary souls finally found their harbor. A year later, the sunlight of a late spring afternoon streamed through the tall library windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny, dancing diamonds. The room, once a bastion of silence and solitude, was now filled with a quiet, companionable warmth. The scent of beeswax and old paper was now mingled with the fresh, sweet fragrance of roses cut that morning from the Duchess's thriving garden. Annalise sat curled in one of the large leather armchairs, a sketchbook open on her lap. Her pencil moved with practiced ease, capturing the man in the opposite chair. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, was reading aloud from a volume of poetry, his deep voice a soothing melody in the tranquil room. The severe lines of his face had softened over the past year. The permanent tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a relaxed posture. He smiled often now, a slow, wonderful curving of his lips that was reserved almost exclusively for her. She paused in her sketching, simply watching him. The formidable Iron Duke of society's gossip was a ghost, a fiction. The man before her was her husband, her friend, her Alistair. He was a man who brought her tea in her studio when she was lost in her work. A man who would listen for hours as she spoke of her plans for the gardens. A man whose hand always sought hers when they walked the corridors of their home. He looked up, as if feeling her gaze, and his reading trailed off. "Is something amiss?" he asked, his brow furrowing with gentle concern. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "No," she said softly. "Nothing is amiss. Everything is perfect." He set the book aside and rose, crossing the room to her. He knelt beside her chair, his expression tender. "A year ago today," he murmured, "you walked through my front door, dressed in grey and looking like you were facing a firing squad." "I thought I was," she confessed, her hand coming up to rest on his cheek. "I thought it was the end of my life." He turned his head to kiss her palm, a gesture that still made her heart leap. "It was the beginning of mine," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "You brought the light back into this house, Annalise. You brought it back into me." She leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a soft, loving kiss. The marriage of convenience had become the love of a lifetime. The silent, lonely Duke and the overlooked, resilient girl had found in each other not an escape, but a home. Annalise thought of her stepmother's cruel laughter on that long-ago afternoon. The Baroness had meant to send her to her ruin, to have her humiliated and cast out. Instead, in the greatest irony of her life, she had sent her directly into the arms of a man who had loved her for half her life. She had been sent not to her destruction, but to her destiny. Looking at her husband, his handsome face illuminated by the golden light, Annalise knew a profound and settled peace. A person's worth was not measured by the scorn of the world or the cruelty of family. It was measured by the quiet, steady devotion of a loving heart. Her journey had begun in despair, but it had led her here to a life of unimaginable joy. It was never, she realized, too late to begin again.